Hello and welcome to the Tournament Center. I'm Brian David Marshall. It is my pleasure to be joined by Pro Tour Hall of Famer Frank Karsten, and we're continuing our primers on the modern format. And Frank, I can't imagine anyone else I'm going to go to talk about Affinity. What is the appeal of this deck for you?
Well, it's my favorite deck in Modern because, first of all, like all the mathematics involved. With cards like Arcbound Ravager, Cranial Plating, you have to do all these calculations, and I enjoy doing that. I also enjoy the challenge of sequencing all of my cards correctly to maximize all of my mana in the early turns. And I like all of the little tricks. I've been playing the deck since the basic Mirrodin block, so I have a bunch of experience with it and just enjoy how it functions.
It's the first deck that came to be associated with you at the start of your career. It's funny, I'm watching you play this deck, and you're playing against, you know this deck so well, so intimately. You were playing against a Tron player, and he's kind of up against it, and he's going to die, and he's got a handful of cards and a handful of options, and you're looking at him, and he's just like, he's thinking about this card, and you're like,
yeah, I'm like, yeah,
you're
I
just
know.
like in psychic connection with him.
Yeah, he had like the Oblivion Stone in hand and a Ghost Quarter, but I already knew that, and I know how to play around it by putting my counters from the Arcbound Ravager onto my Nexus, and he didn't have enough mana to do everything, and well, I won.
Yeah.
It definitely helps to know the matchups, know the deck, and know how to navigate all of these situations. Experience counts for a lot in Modern.
Well, let's help people get a little bit of experience with Affinity. Let's just talk through the three stages of the game. The early game of Affinity, Mox Opal, Darksteel Citadel, Springleaf Drum, Ornithopter. What are you trying to do in the early turns of the game with this deck?
Well, this is kind of the dream opening. If you have this, then you have access to 2 mana on turn 1, which is just crazy. You can cast Arcbound Ravagers or Steel Overseers, Cranial Platings, whatnot. Basically, the idea is, well, all of these are artifacts, which turn on the synergy. You get a lot of mana early, so you really get these explosive starts. That's really where the strength of Affinity lies.
So you can just deploy these 3 cards, and then have 2 mana at the end of that.
Yeah.
At the end of these 4 cards landing in play.
Yeah.
And still do something else.
Yeah, you can basically dump all of them on the battlefield, like from your hand. Here they go, all tapped, and just play a 2-drop and say go. That's how it goes. 5 permanents on turn 1.
So turn 1's your early game and your mid game?
I guess like the early game might be the mulligans, and like turn 1 is the the mid game or something. It depends on how you define it. But.
Okay, so let's take a look at what the mid game ostensibly looks like. We see, again, nothing super expensive here. We see Inkmoth Nexus, Blinkmoth Nexus, Vault Scourge, Signal Pest.
Yeah, these are all things that you would do on turn 1 or 2, making indeed the mid-game turn 1 or 2 for Affinity.
The mid-game being attack.
Yeah, pretty much. Like playing some 1-drops. The deck also has a bunch of cheap artifacts, like this Ornithopter, that makes Signal Pest much better.
Right.
Vault Scourge is a nice element of the deck that you can just play for 1 mana. It's an artifact. The lifelink matters a lot with cards that boost your creatures. And the lands are a huge part of the deck as well, because they are lands that turn into, well, artifacts, hence turning on all the synergies, and also allowing you to play all of these mana cards without getting flooded in the late game.
Right, and we talked a little bit about the sweeper, a card like Oblivion Stone. It'll have that keyword that is the bane of Magic players everywhere.
Yep.
Destroy all non-land permanents.
Yeah.
So,
and these also help a lot against Shatterstorm or hate cards that are at sorcery speed, Pyroclasm, stuff like that. Yeah.
And the way you're making these cards more formidable is in your late game, and we're going to see, a couple cards, Cranial Plating. Oh, look at you! You love this deck. So talk us through these 4 different cards and the different directions you can go to kill your opponent.
Well, this is basically why you are playing the deck. Like a card like Arcbound Ravager or Cranial Plating doesn't really do much by itself, but when suddenly you made your deck in a way to turn on Cranial Plating to give +8/+0 for just 1 mana, it becomes a huge swing. Arcbound Ravager can also grow to a humongous size quickly, and then even when it dies, it just turns another guy into a big size. Steel Overseer, especially in a deck that dumps all of its permanents in play so quickly with the 0-cost cards, the 1 mana creatures, the acceleration. You just get a huge board and pump it up quickly. And Edge Champion is kind of the bane of kind of grindy mid-range decks, especially when combined with the Cranial Plating and the Arcbound Ravager. It's not hard to turn on Metalcraft. In fact, it's pretty rare if you don't have 3
Right,
artifacts.
We saw a scenario where you could have it on turn 1.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
in
for
fact,
sure.
on turn 1, you could play that Cranial Plating as the last card in that sequence with that 2 mana, and then on turn 2, be attacking for 5, assuming you don't play any more artifacts on turn 2.
Yeah, and usually you do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, turn 3 kills are rare with the deck, but they are possible, which is a nice example of why this deck is so explosive.
But I think your suggestion for anyone who's thinking about picking up Affinity, and it would probably be true of any of the staple decks, is going to be practice the deck a lot.
Yeah, it is a tricky deck to play with all of the sequencing, with the Mox Opals and the Springleaf Drums and the Man lands. There's also, like an often made beginner mistake is not to really use Arcbound Ravager to its full extent. I always play super aggressively, like on turn 3 I just dump my whole board into the Ravager and just kind of force my opponent to answer it. But yeah, it is a tricky deck, especially because you have so many choices. Do I equip? Do I turn a guy into a creature? Do I play something else? But when you play enough, it's rewarding and is one of the better decks in Modern.
Okay, one of the better decks in Modern. It's good enough for a Pro Tour Hall of Famer. It's definitely good enough for you. This is Brian David Marshall signing off from the Tournament Center with Frank Karsten.